Well, good morning, and I'm Lani Madsen, your host for this edition of Meeting of the Minds. It's a half-hour conversation with community leaders on demonstrating how we can all exercise civility in the public arena without backing down from our ideals. And today's topic is follow the money, follow the rules, campaign finance reform, transparency, why or if it matters. So I want to welcome my two guests today, Glen Morgan, Bart Haggin. Thank you for being here, and I'll give a little introduction to Glen and a question to him first, and then turn to Bart. So Glen, you are a conservative activist from Thurston County, currently working as executive director of the Citizens Alliance for Property Rights, and that's where we've met because I've been following some property rights issues. But that's not why you're here today. You've picked up a kind of an odd hobby in some ways. You've become the notorious citizen behind a series of Public Disclosure Commission complaints filed with the Attorney General's office. And could you tell us how you stumbled onto this activity?
Sure, yeah, and it really did start last fall, and it began with, and I've been familiar with, as much as anybody would be casually familiar with the Public Disclosure Commission, but it really started with watching Bob Ferguson really renew a commitment to enforcing the public disclosure rules, and also with kind of a back and forth Thurston County case where the state Democrat Party filed a complaint on me, and there was some back and forth that kind of started it there. And then I had filed a complaint on State Senator Sam Hunt, and he had written a letter to the Public Disclosure Commission saying that Glen Morgan obviously didn't know anything about campaign finance law, and he was right. I don't think I did, and I recognize that I think he was accurate and that I probably didn't understand it, and I thought, this is really an opportunity to educate myself about this process and educate it and just study it more and understand it better, and really that kind of began this process of looking into maybe some of the areas that need to be reformed and some of the things that should be improved, and trying to figure out where the boundaries really are on the law versus how it's actually being implemented, and it really started back then. So I'd say October of last year is when it began. So
okay, that's really accelerated on you.
Yeah, it's become, now once you're committed, you kind of have to keep going. So that's where we're at right now. Okay. Yeah.
Well, Bart, just to introduce you as the notorious liberal activist to the table.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, you are a former Rogers High School coach and educator, a legendary Spokane road race runner, and past candidate for U.S. Congress. That's what I have down here on your bio.
That's about right.
So in your years as a political activist, I'm sure you've developed some opinions about money and politics. And what keeps you motivated to stay involved?
Well, in recent years, I've really become fairly knowledgeable and been kind of a student of neuroscience. And as a result of that, I think I would say that empathy has really driven me to my present involvement. But I've been involved, I always tell people when they ask me questions like that I collected money for Henry Wallace in 1948. So it's like I've been at this for a while. And I did run for Congress, and I've been involved at the county and state level for a long time.
Okay. So you can bring some institutional memory to this conversation.
Absolutely.
Perfect.
But not enough to be able to really regale you with all of them. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the elephant in the room, or maybe it's a donkey, and that would be the citizen complaint that has resulted in charges against the Spokane County Democrats for some campaign finance violations, and that's really what has accelerated this as an issue in Spokane here. And I appreciate you coming over from Olympia to join us, Glen. You both have an interest in long distance running, but let's see what we can find some common ground in politics and how money is involved in politics. Glen, could you tell us a little bit about those citizen complaints on the local party?
Yeah, and I mean it's and I think it's important to note that the Attorney General has taken up 12 lawsuits that based on complaints that I filed with him in the last 6 months now. And so the Spokane County case is probably one of the more significant ones. I think that's fair to say that. And it was really one of the more significant cases, just because of the scope and the breadth of the violations in that case. And it's also pretty consistent, I think, with how Bob Ferguson has discussed. Our Attorney General has said that he really wants to focus on campaign finance, and he's really been emphasizing that. He's set up He's the first attorney general that's actually set aside a dedicated department to focus on this. Historically, they would just occasionally take up cases if they were referred to them by the Public Disclosure Commission. And so that focus, I think you're really seeing just an example of the renewed focus on campaign finance based on what he's deciding. I do think that case stood out in my mind. I spent a lot more time looking into that one just because of the scope of some of the violations. I didn't actually expect when I started that I would find violations that significant in the process. So most of them I expected to find were a little bit more minor. But I found that there's actually probably a declining just across the state. There's been a decline in following some of the public disclosure rules, and it's kind of interesting to study why that's happened. And for example, I think if I was the Democrats, this is ironic a little bit, I think, but I would blame the Republicans at this point in time, and I'll tell you why. The Public Disclosure Commission process, the way it's set up, at least the disclosure rules, there's an implication that there's two different sides to every political fight, and that each side's going to kind of hold each other accountable, and that because the PDC doesn't actually have the staff to go out and analyze every single report that comes in. They have 5 million documents online right now. There's no way that they could go out and actually look at everything. So they assume that there's two sides to every fight. And what I found is that in counties like Whatcom or Snohomish, where the Republicans were at some time in history, whether they were recently or not, but there was a little bit of, they'd filed complaints on the Democrats, for example. And so in those counties, the Democrat parties were very, they seemed to be pretty close to compliance, as close as you could get. Whereas in the counties where the Republicans seem to have not paid any attention, or they haven't filed complaints ever maybe, or even done anything, there was a lot lower level of compliance on the other side. And so ironically, if you want to be holding yourself to more higher level of compliance in public disclosure rules, you actually want your opposition to be a little assertive out there occasionally, just a little bit, at least feel like they will be. And so I hadn't thought of that before, but it's really come across pretty starkly across the state when I've really looked at different areas, and I wouldn't have ever expected or anticipated that kind of an analysis to come out of this.
Well, that's an interesting place to go back to the roots of the Public Disclosure Commission, and that's something I'd really like to ask you about, Bart, because it was passed by initiative just before I started voting. So it's always been there, and it just sounds like, okay, that's a good thing. Public disclosure is a good thing. Why do we have one? Why did it get pushed into place then? What was going on?
Well, I think the PDC is a result of people's anxiety about a fair playing field, or any kind of reaction to the displeasure that they find in the election process. And so I myself, in running for Congress, didn't have anything to do with the PDC, the Federal Elections Commission,
right.
And found that really interesting. And I had a really top-notch treasurer that dealt with that. I think it's largely a matter of trying to make sure that there is some fairness and equity in the process. And I was in a unique position as far as the local Democratic Party is concerned, because just as I was relieved of my position in the 7th Legislative District, that's when everything hit the fan. And so I avoided any of the temptation to make some pontificating comments about that situation. And then recently I've come back on the executive committee of this local Democratic Party, and kind of caught up, and now we're talking about damage control. So we've come to some sort of conclusions about changes in the money-raising process and so forth, and I become chair of the fundraising committee. In relation to that, I think that it was really unfortunate, and I don't have, in other words, I have no dog in that fight because I was not involved in it at that level. When I came on the executive board, why, the program was always in place of creating an executive director and new changes in the fundraising process and all of those kinds of things. And so I looking at it from a distance, just like almost everybody else, it just does seem to me that there was gross negligence, and that there was, I think, some negligence on the part of the executive board, quite frankly, too, to not stay up and be questioning the kinds of things that the chair was doing, and he was serving in a role as the chair and as executive director. I mean, I did not support that, but there were some justifying reasons for it. Mm-hmm. I think that the whole circumstances is unfortunate. I think there should be contrition, and there should be an acknowledgement that there's a new game in town with a new chair, and that we're going forward to try to make changes that will be satisfactory and will be ethical and logical and reasonable.
Okay. Well, Glen, you made an interesting point about how it's having those two sides in the fight that keeps one sharp.
Right.
And you've been a lot of times in other media reports, you're immediately identified as a Freedom Foundation activist. You haven't worked
Right.
there for a while.
A couple years, yeah.
There's been hints that you must be tied to the Koch brothers, and
Right.
you're just out to destroy Democrats.
Right.
But I don't get that sense when I talk to you. So how do you think this complacency kind of comes about? I think that's kind of what you're talking about, Bart. You kind of get semi-familiar with the PDC reports and you sort of float. And
Right.
Where do you think that complacency comes from? What drives it?
Part of it was, I mean, what it really looks to me like is that I think that across the state, and I don't know if how much this applies exactly to Spokane, but I think across the state in general, I think the Democrat Party has been much more effective and much more educated and much more knowledgeable, and they've had people who are more familiar with the public disclosure process, at least based on volume of complaints. If you go back the last 10 years, you're going to see that about 80% of the complaints are filed by people who might identify themselves as Democrats one way or another. And the ironic element of that is that it's forced these Republican groups to be more compliant because they're fearful that there's going to be a complaint that's filed on them. And so they tend to follow the rules more. But then as I started to get into this, I would call up the local Republican group in whatever county it was that I was looking at, and I would say, God, have you guys even bothered to look over here in Pierce County? They haven't filed a single document in 2017. What are you guys doing? And they'll say, no, we haven't ever looked. And I say, well, aren't you? You should be. You're filing documents. Aren't you bothering to look? And they would say, well, they would have this perception that the Public Disclosure Commission's biased, or they don't listen to us anyway, and it doesn't do any good, or whatever. And that's a mistake I think that they've made. The Republicans seem to have made. It seems to be a common thing around the state, with the exception of a few different pockets. And so the Democrats are much more. They're much more effective at it. They have a lot of people that are very good, Alex Bond, some of these other people at the state party that are really capable of filing these complaints. And so that was something I didn't necessarily expect to find as I was looking at this. But the other thing I am getting more of a sense, and I started out with this idea that I felt like there were some parts of the public disclosure rules that could probably be reformed. I mean, the intention of the public disclosure laws, just like the Public Records Act and the Open Public Meetings Act, was transparency, it was disclosure. We really want to know what's going on. But I think over the years, there's been a kind of a kludgy hodgepodge addition by the legislature at periodic times, sometimes rulemaking in the Public Disclosure Commission level, where they're adding things to it that kind of create an edifice that's really become creaky and
You mean
just
a bureaucratic?
Bureaucratic edifice. You know, it doesn't make sense anymore on some of the rules. And I'll give you one example, and this would be like a reform that I would make. Right now, when you file your C1, you're obligated the day you file it under statute to file your disclosure contributions and expenditures. Day one, C3, C4s. They have to be filed that day. The law is explicit that day. You must file it. The problem with that is that, and then you're also required to electronically file C3s and C4s, and that's a relatively recent change. The problem is that when you go and sign up and you file a C1, which is an indication I'm going to be a candidate or a committee, that form, they don't give you, the Public Disclosure Commission doesn't even give you a form, a number to register and file your documents online for 4 or 5 days. It's called an ORCA number. And that means you're instantly in violation, because any rational or prudent person who's deciding to run for office, especially if they aren't that experienced, you've probably reserved a website at least. Mm-hmm. You've probably expended some money at a point in time. I mean, anybody would do that. And you're an instant violator the minute you file for office. And I have found this to be almost across the board, without exception, everybody's in violation of the law. Well, that indicates, it doesn't mean everybody's trying to violate the law. It just means that the way the law is set up and the process is set up now, that it's not right. If everybody's violating the law, there's something wrong with the law. There's not something wrong with everybody. So usually, like there's some reforms like that really need to be addressed at the legislative level, because it's a law passed by the legislature right now. And those are things the legislature is the only entity that can come in and fix it.
So let's talk about what's in the way of the legislature being interested in changing the PDC. And I know that that you've expressed to me an opinion that it's become an incumbency protection issue. And,
right. I have a strong feeling about that, and I don't know. I mean, one of my concerns about the way, if you talk to an incumbent politician, they'll complain about the public disclosure rules, but they have zero incentive to fix them, because if they're in office, they've already achieved, they've jumped over whatever hurdle, or they've weathered the storm, and now they're in. And by fixing those rules, the only people they're helping is their potential challengers in the future. So they have no incentive. The second level that reduces their incentive structure is that if they are the one who proposes, say, hey, I want to fix these rules, they're immediately going to be attacked. It doesn't matter, Democrat or Republican. They're going to be attacked for, what are you trying to hide? Or you can't follow these rules. That's why you're trying to change them. And so there's just no incentive for incumbent politicians to take the effort, because it is an effort to go through and make a change in the law like that. And so I fear that we're leading down the road with really good intentions, but with bad outcomes, because new people getting involved in the political process feel punished by it.
So Bart, let's talk about the money a little bit. As a former candidate, and actually I'm a former candidate as well. The whole point of the PDC is supposed to be to figure out and see where the money is coming from, and then see what you can learn from that. Now, sometimes what you learn isn't what you think it's going to learn. When I ran, and I was running in the 7th Legislative District, I had a series of donations from the west side of the state. I have a very large extended family. I can't help it if my former New York City really progressive liberal aunt decides to send me $100 because she likes me. I mean, but so sometimes you don't learn what you think you're learning. But how do you see the role of money in politics, and what should the PDC be able to tell us about that money?
Well, it seems to me that money in politics is based on the idea that the more money you have, the more influence that you can make on the candidates and in the legislature itself. And I think that the main thing that we want to avoid is the idea that you can buy or rent politicians. And so the PDC is an attempt to make the information about the politician more readily available, which is transparency, which is fine. But I think that there is also the temptation here to think about what can be done to avoid the image of these people selling out to the contributors, and this is particularly a problem now with the two major changes that have taken place in federal law, that money is speech, and that corporations are people, are not people. So it seems like that's the issue that should be the focus of the PDC, is to make sure that that there is some kind of fairness and equity, and I don't see that. I mean, the basic idea here is you can spend as much money as you can, just as long as you do it in a legal way. And so that would be my criticism of the present system, is that we have the illusion that, it's the perception and it's reality that money is buying elections, it's buying public office. And I think that that's regrettable. And so I would just say that what we've got to do is make changes in the law that make that more equitable. Obviously, we have some circumstances like Maine and Arizona, where they have public funds available for the people to participate in the election process, and that's slightly flawed because of some legal challenges, but it's still, I think, a better way to go. And at the very least, I think that there should be an attempt to make sure that the people that are running for office have timely and well-publicized and complete disclosure. And I'm not sure that the PDC actually does that.
Well, one of the frustrations for an ordinary citizen trying to monitor even PDC reports is just the sheer volume. Is there some dollar level that you could say, a whole bunch of $50 donations from the neighbors, we really don't need 6 pages of those on the PDC, so because that's not what's a problem. But once it gets to what number, at some number, we want to see those, and so we just want to track those, and then you can actually maybe have a difference. Are there some reforms like that you're interested in?
And I mean, those are good questions, and I don't know how to answer that because sometimes I'll look at something like, I think debt reporting was something originally I thought that the Public Disclosure Commission, and actually it's in FEC Rule 2 about how you report debt in campaigns, I thought, well, we're exaggerating the importance of this debt reporting. And as I looked into it, one of that assumption that I had is I've started to rethink that a little bit because it ignores the reality of politics, which is that the game of running for political office, oftentimes it seems like there's always these loopholes that they have around it. So if you raise the threshold of disclosure, then suddenly you'll see this huge number of people donating at below $25 or whatever that number is. And so I don't know that there's any magic formula on that level. I think the disclosure transparency is very important. Making that data more accessible to the public is actually very important as well, and that should be an easier thing for us to do with technology. And I know that one thing people oftentimes think the Public Disclosure Commission is this enforcement arm, but it's less an enforcement arm. That's really not what the majority of their staff do. Most of them are just focused on trying to keep these documents available, the 5 million documents.
They appear like paper documents online, even though they're filed electronically.
Even though they're filed electronically, yeah. But I mean, at least by that effort that they're making to provide those documents, that's a tremendous service. And again, it's based on this idea that there's people like us out here that are going to care and that are going to look and that are going to report or do something about it when we see a problem or when we see something happening there. And so that might be the part that's missing or has been missing for a while, and that people aren't paying as much attention to what's actually going on. But I don't know that there's, we're always trying to find some way to game the political process, and this might be a philosophical difference that we might have, but I think that there's always going to be money in politics. There's no way to take it out entirely, and there's going to be more money in politics the more the political world starts to encompass private life. The more that government's involved in regulating these different entities, the more those entities are going to want to influence government. The less they influence, the less they regulate those entities, the less those entities have any reason to be involved in giving money to government. Microsoft didn't donate any money to political candidates until they started being regulated, and then suddenly millions of dollars started flowing from Microsoft. And so I think that if we want less money in politics, this would be that philosophical difference we probably have, is that government needs to be less involved in the private lives of people. But again, those are utopian schemes that just don't exist in reality, and
but that sounds like
we have to try to find this balance to how we have this transparency, and that's the struggle that I find. I'm going through trying to document and trying to see where that balance is, and I think that's a struggle that a lot of people have looking at it, regardless of what your political perspective.
Well, that's a philosophical question I want to toss to you.
I would just like to comment on the concept. I think that the important thing here is the amount of information that gets out from the PDC. And the real crucial element of the PDC is the disclosure. And there is almost zero effort to disclose. And so the data is all there, but there's virtually nothing, no kinds of lists of contributors or anything that comes out in the media.
You have to go dig. You really do have to dig.
You have to dig. You have to dig for that information, and maybe it's good for a soundbite in a campaign or something like that, but it's not something that really enhances the awareness and the knowledge that is available to the general public.
And it would require that's almost a comment about the media in general. And I've had this conversation with some journalists around the state too about you need to look at how do we report on this information? It comes in, and then is anybody paying attention to the 1,364 documents that were just filed last month? And compiling them. And the staff at the PDC isn't going to do that generally, because if they do, they're going to be accused of bias, or there's going to be other problems that happens there. So it's going to end up being the journalist that actually gets that information, how they report on it. So we're definitely raising issues here, I think, that are related to disclosure, but it may not be related to the PDC. It may be more related to how us as citizen journalists or how professional journalists actually report on this stuff.
Well, but I think it is incumbent upon the PDC to make that information more available to the press, because my objection to the PDC behavior is that they really don't push disclosure of sources, and particularly individual sources, so that in any kind of the candidate disclosure requirements, there's very little that really comes out into the public realm. And the idea here is that the people with the big money that made the contributions and so forth, those are calling the shots. And if you never know who those people are, then you can't ever decide whether they are or they're not. So I'm very critical of the kind of information that gets out, and the PDC is partly responsible for that.
I think most people probably don't realize the PDC really has just taken what was a mail-in these paper form system and put the paper form online, and you fill it out, but there's no way to sort that. And so if you want to look at someone who's got 200 people reporting, or 200 sources that have been reported, you have to basically page through every single page.
Yeah.
And so the PDC, you're asking the PDC to be pushing information out there, but they just put it on record. Anybody can go look at it, but they don't push it, and that's probably what they're afraid of, being accused of bias if they push.
Yeah, and I do think I think they are on the road to doing that. James, now I'm blanking on his last name. Sorry, an employee at the Public Disclosure Commission made a presentation at Tech Conference last weekend, and I went and listened to him. And I think actually that is their goal, is to get to a point where the databases are set up to be more searchable.
So you could sort it.
And I that is actually, I think, part of this open data plan that they're working on, and I'm probably using that a lot more right now than most people are using it as I'm digging through these files. I don't pretend that it's easy. I can tell you it isn't.
Well,
it takes a lot of time to dig through it.
Actually,
yeah.
I mean, if you know the protocol to follow, and it's and I think it's really interesting. I go there just to see who's buying the ad space.
Right.
So. Yeah, I think it's the PDC is a good deal. I just think it has to be pushed further.
Yeah. Well, and I think that there's a lot of opportunity for reform, and I'm hoping that there's enough data collected. I mean, one of the other things I'm looking at is that if there's a statute on the books, then people are regularly violating it, but it's never enforced. So it means that they'll never file charges on it. They'll never get in trouble for. Is that statute really? Does it really matter anymore? If it's a law you're never going to enforce, then why have it on the books? And so I'm hoping to build up a statistical data, reasonable apples-to-apples comparison of violations of specific statutes that they're never going to enforce anyway. And so maybe we should just reform the statute. So
and that's another large philosophical question, is that when we have statutes on the books that we are not enforcing or are being selectively enforced, then that's what creates that disrespect for the law, or that kind
Correct.
of. There's too much. I can't cope with all these, so I'm just going to hope I don't get in trouble and make my way. So Bart, do you have any final words of wisdom for Glen? Because I don't think he's giving up on this hobby. So what would you suggest that he do?
Well, I think in general, I would urge him to do some checking before he makes the complaints, and give the people some kind of an idea of where he's going with them. In the case of the Spokane thing, obviously mistakes were made, and if that had been conveyed to the people, they would have probably been able to pick it up. I mean, the guy was not diligent in his reporting, but nobody knew. And so if people were able to say, I'm going to check your records maybe you better want to get those things in order. You know, I mean, I think that's the point. That's the purpose of it, is to get people to comply. It's not to gotcha them. So I think that would be my advice.
Okay, so Bart's advice to you, Glenn, is to give people a heads up and say, you know, I'm looking at your PDC records, and then see if they scramble, and then. Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that's a fair. I've tried to broadcast that as widely as possible. I am looking at all these PDC records. I do hope that there's an opportunity to make some. At this point in time, we've committed enough time into this. I hope that there's an opportunity to make some reform to the statute that makes it both easier for new people to get involved in the political process and not be punished by it, but also to maybe clean and streamline the process up so that compliance is a little bit easier without sacrificing transparency, and that the archaic nature of some of the Byzantine rules that have been kind of kludged together on this thing, that they can be cleaned up and made a little bit more modern so that it's easier. We have fewer problems moving forward. And I hope that that's an outcome. Again, this is maybe a Don Quixote tilting at windmills effort. I don't know, but I'm hoping that the legislature is willing to take that up this next year, and I hope that there's a bipartisan consensus that it's worth the effort to come together and make some of these changes. And if not this session, maybe the session after that, and we'll see if the effort that I'm putting into it's going to produce some positive results like that.
Okay, and I'll give some advice to all the citizens of the state: is don't immediately accuse your legislator of trying to hide something if they want to take on this reform that really needs to happen.
That's good advice. Yeah.
Okay.
I
Thank
think
you.
a little extra reminder from the PDC to the candidates and so forth, be sure you've got your ducks in a row here.
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Maybe
Yep.
we'll have some more citizens all keeping an eye on this. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you both for joining me. I really appreciate the conversation.
All right.
Enjoyed
thank you
it.
for having us. Yeah. Thank you.
The PDC to make some kind of contact with each one of the committees, not the candidate, because the candidate's got a lot of ideas on their mind and so forth, but to the campaign and say, have you gotten your stuff in? And that. Yeah, because in the heat of a campaign, it's like distance running. You just go brain dead before,
Right.
During, and after. Yeah, and so it seems like there should be, if they're going to make a big deal out of it, they should do a better job about warning people.
Okay. This is audio, but 30 seconds.
Okay.
10 seconds.
Okay. And you're just doing this in audio? Or you're
you do video.
So I can't make
Okay.
hand signs.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
No number one.
I was going to do that, so you threw off my whole game here.
So
So
uncharacteristic.
yeah,
We'll sell you the original.
More of a-
yeah, exactly.
Okay, so-
You wanna- I'll just ask a question. Okay,
So I'll just-
I go like this. I'm trying to get my,
Got it.
grab a,
so-
I'm trying to
so,
grab the
and-
end.
And I can stand.
Mhm.
Okay.
No 5-minute answers.
Right,
You know,
right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
When
yeah.
I go like this, and no, she's gonna start wrapping it up.
Sure.
Just so you have.
Sure.
Okay, that works.
Because you're in the blind.
Yeah.
You know,
Right.
She
Okay.
knows, but
Yeah,
Yeah.
you don't know that she's antsy about your finishing
That's
the
right.
answer.
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And you, that does.
Okay. Start with a little bit of history.
Just yeah, you'll be asking part of the history. Yeah. hmm
We're here today at Meeting of the Minds with Bart Haggin and Glen Morgan. I'm Lani Madsen, and we're talking about the Public Disclosure Commission. And Bart, a little bit of the history of the PDC, if you could provide that for our listeners.
Boy, I couldn't. That's not my area of expertise, and I really don't like that kind of stuff. But as I said, I was more familiar with the FEC situation because I ran for office. And I think that's really important for people to understand that when they run for office, they're going to have to make disclosure. And I think the PDC works pretty well, but I have no idea of the nuts and bolts of that.
Okay, so part of the nuts and bolts is that it started out as a paper-based, and now it's gone online, but it's not really online.
Yeah, and it was a
Glen?
citizens initiative that originally formed it along with the Public Records Act and the Open Public Meetings Act. It was an effort to sunshine laws, basically, were passed in the state in
We're
1972.
talking 70s here.
Correct, yeah, 1972. And so the effort was to basically make it more transparent, good intentions, and the Public Disclosure Commission started collecting millions of pieces of paper, and now they've converted to doing this online, and that makes it easier for us to access that information and to share that information and to show it to the rest of the world as to whether you're compliant or not, or whether you're transparent or not.
So we have all this information, we're just not making very good use of it, and that's kind of where you're looking at
Absolutely.
right now.
I believe that there's a lot of reform opportunities here.
Okay, if they could just move from paper to a real database, that'd be a good step. Okay, well, thank you. Parties are going to keep each other honest because you're going to look at your opponent. And
Right.
Okay, this is Meeting of the Minds. I'm your host, Lani Madsen, and I've have Bart Haggin and Glen Morgan here today. And Glenn, we've been talking about the Public Disclosure Commission, and you've had some pretty sharp words for Republicans on not holding up their end of the deal with the PDC.
Yeah, because when you really look at it, the intention of the public disclosure laws had an implicit idea that there were going to be two sides to every political contest, and that and typically that's party related. So you have Democrats and Republicans, and that one of the ways that you would hold people to compliance, making sure that they're fulfilling their obligations and following the law and reporting on who's donating to them or how they're spending their money, is that the other side would catch each side would catch each other in the mistakes, and part of that is filing complaints or pointing it out to them. And because of that, both sides would know that somebody's watching and they care, and so they would really be careful with it. And what I've seen happen around the state is that for whatever reason, the Republicans, and there's a variety of reasons why, they've failed to uphold their kind of intentional, or at least implied portion of this bargain, and they stopped filing complaints or even paying attention, I think in some cases, to what the Democrats were doing on the other side. And that unfortunately that's actually hurt the Democrats more than it's hurt the Republicans, because when the Democrat committees or candidates maybe in certain areas get out of compliance, nobody's calling them on it when it's small, and so when they finally do get caught, it's a much bigger problem. And I think that's what you saw happen here in Spokane and King County and Thurston County and elsewhere.
That's an interesting. Yeah, sometimes you need an accountability partner to keep yourself, whether it's as a long distance runner or on a diet or whatever. You need an accountability partner. Well, we need to all be doing a better job of that with the Public Disclosure Commission.
Well, I got to say that in 30 years of teaching, the thing that you always tried to avoid was audio-visual aids.
Yeah.
Because they were always breaking down, and something was always going wrong.
Yep.
And then it was very, very frustrating. So,
Showed the movies in Todd Auditorium at WSU was one of my jobs, and there was one night where something caught on the projector, and the movie broke in 5 places, and I had to get it spliced together for the next show and hope that it went through the machine. Yeah. And if it jammed in the slot, it would catch fire, which was not real cool either. Yep.
okay.
I'm Lani Madsen here at Meeting of the Minds with Glen Morgan and Bart Haggin. We've been discussing the Public Disclosure Commission, and I'd like to ask each of you to provide just a little bit of advice on a reform that you would like to see going forward.
You want me
Bart,
to start?
go ahead.
Sure. Well, I mentioned previously that I really think that the Public Disclosure Commission should make it a high priority to get the information out. So, they can't control the media, but they can encourage the media. And I think that that's a very important part, particularly in terms of disclosure of the people who have made the campaign contributions. And the other part is, I think that they need to do a better job about alerting people to the problems of the public disclosure requirements. And I think it's gets to be kind of a gotcha situation for the information.
And Glenn, a couple of comments.
Generally what I would say is that if the PDC could do anything, and it's going to require some legislative involvement, it would be to reform the process so that it's easy to understand, even for new people coming into the political arena, and also so that it really takes advantage of the technology that exists today to make it more efficient and more streamlined. People care about who's donating to campaigns. I don't know that they need to put as much emphasis on how money's being spent, say, or other little details that are maybe not as critical or germane to what's going on in the political scene.
Okay, and getting to a searchable database. Right now, it's just like a stack of paper online to take a look at. And searchable database would help both of your reforms.
And I'd urge Glenn to run for office, and he might be a little more tolerant.
There you go. Bart's urging Glenn to run for office. I think you have run for office.
3 times, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Oh, yeah.
So have all of us. It's a bad habit.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you so much.